to all of you, and especially to our tonight's guests, Michaela Dudley and Laura Borcher, and our host, Greta Olsen. I'm sorry I have to read because otherwise I will talk too much. So my name is Katrin Lehnen. I am the director of the ZMI. This is the Center of Media and Interactivity at the University of Gießen. And it's a great pleasure for me to open up tonight's debate. Although the topic of the debate and the reasons why we have to talk about the questions how the Supreme Court is influencing the midterms and cultural politics in America and Germany are not a pleasure at all. It is a good and long-lasting tradition of our center to talk about current political developments and to reflect on their social and cultural impact. The ZMI is an interdisciplinary center at the university that celebrated its 20th anniversary last year. Since its founding, members of the ZMI do research on aspects of our digital, respectively post-digital culture, questions of diversity, language change, communication practices, as well as digital literacy are treated in different projects. People and ideas have changed during the last 20 years, as you can imagine. Nevertheless, a major concern of the ZMI is to bring scientific knowledge interest to the public and to open discourses in different social contexts. It is also a pleasure for us to develop new formats and to experiment with different forms of presentation and discussion. An event like this one today is a good example for this, I think. The ZMI has a tradition in observing US politics. This is exemplified by the following three events in recent years. First, the big US election night in Gießen 2016, when Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton competed against each other. Second, the event on the last US midterms on December 2018 with the title Voting for Trump, what do the US midterm elections mean for Trump and for us? And finally, a debate titled Voices from Abroad, Americans in Germany discuss the 2020 US elections on the occasions of the last US presidential election 2 years ago. And it's very nice to continue this kind of debate tonight with you. Let me just go over to German at the end. Einen sehr, sehr großen Dank für diese Veranstaltung möchte ich an Greta Olsen aussprechen, die die heutige Veranstaltung sowie viele interessante und wichtige Debatten zuvor am ZMI ins Leben gerufen hat. Und ich freue mich auf einen tollen, ich glaube auch vergnüglichen Abend und gebe jetzt das Wort an Dr. Herrnhahn, der Geschäftsführerin des ZMI.
A warm welcome also on my behalf and on behalf of the section Media and Gender of the ZMI. I'm going to continue in German, but afterwards we are going to continue in English. Herzlich willkommen auch im Namen der Sektion Medien und Gender des ZMI. Das Thema des heutigen Abends ist die Rechtsprechung des obersten Gerichtshofs der Vereinigten Staaten von Amerika und ihre Auswirkungen auf die bevorstehenden Zwischenwahlen sowie auf die Geschlechterverhältnisse in den USA und in Deutschland. Wie aktuell die Debatte ist, zeigt nicht nur die Revision des Rechts auf Abtreibung von Juni dieses Jahres, sondern auch die ganz aktuelle Debatte um die mögliche Abschaffung von Affirmative Action beim Zugang zu US-amerikanischen Universitäten. Auch in Deutschland hatten gerade in den letzten Jahren die Entscheidungen des Bundesverfassungsgerichts und oberster Gerichtshöfe immer wieder weitreichende Bedeutung für geschlechtsbezogene Persönlichkeitsrechte und damit auch die Geschlechterverhältnisse. So führte beispielsweise die Verurteilung der Gießener Gynäkologin Christina Hähnel aufgrund des Paragraphen 219a des Strafgesetzbuchs zu einer Beschwerde beim Bundesverfassungsgericht. Diese wiederum führte dazu, 2022 diesen Paragraphen abschaffte. Ärztinnen dürfen fortan über Möglichkeiten des Schwangerschaftsabbruchs informieren. Ebenfalls im Juni 2022 entschied das Oberlandesgericht Frankfurt am Main, dass das Unternehmen Deutsche Bahn AG KundInnen nicht zwingen darf, sich über die Anrede als Frau oder Mann, etwa beim digitalen Kauf einer Fahrkarte, einem dieser beiden Geschlechter zuzuordnen. Das Gericht trug damit dem Recht nicht-binärer Personen auf Nichtdiskriminierung Rechnung. Die Entscheidung wird erwartungsgemäß auch Auswirkungen auf die Praxis anderer Unternehmen und öffentlicher Einrichtungen haben. Noch 2018 hatte der Bundesgerichtshof hingegen entschieden, dass Sparkassenkundinnen kein Recht darauf haben, im Femininum adressiert zu werden, wenn sie es möchten. Wie diese Beispiele zeigen, stehen gerichtliche Entscheidungen, Gesetzgebung und gesellschaftliche Entwicklungen in einem engen Zusammenhang. Bei aller Unterschiedlichkeit von Genderproblematiken und Thematiken in den USA und in Deutschland gibt es auch Gemeinsamkeiten und politisch-kulturelle Wechselwirkungen. Ich freue mich daher, dass wir heute am Vorabend der Zwischenwahlen in den USA mit Michaela Dudley, Laura Borchert und Greta Olsen 3 Personen hören werden, die sich sehr gut mit US-amerikanischer Politik im Hinblick auf geschlechtsbezogene Grundrechte und Geschlechterpolitiken auskennen. Ich freue mich auf Einblicke in die aktuelle politische Situation in den USA und Einschätzungen dazu, welche Entwicklungen im Hinblick auf Selbstbestimmung im Bereich von Sexualität und Geschlechtsidentität künftig zu erwarten sind. Einen schönen Abend Ihnen und uns allen.
Start.
Good evening. I'd first like to thank the Center for Media and Interactivity for organizing and financing this event tonight, and particularly the section Gender and Media. Thank you so much. Without you, it wouldn't have been possible to be here. Briefly to myself, my name is Greta Olsen. I have a chair here, a professorship in American and English Literary and Cultural Studies. And this event is part of a lecture series, which is about thinking beyond gender, the title of a book that I edited with others a few years ago, to think about how gender and sexuality issues intersect, always intersect, and have to be thought about with other categories of identity, which largely determine the way we are met in the world, such as migration status, the color of our skin, the way we are perceived in terms of our sexual and gender identities, and in terms of religion. Moving out a discussion of gender into a discussion of diversity is, I believe, one of the most important pieces of work we as university educators and as universities have to do. Hence, tonight, to also ask for voices which are not just other professors like myself, like Dr. Michaela Dudley, and also like Laura Borchert, who is also an activist. I also want to say how delighted I am to see you all here. It has been a long time, I believe, since we did the Me Too debate, since I've been in this room for a really larger thing, and I want to welcome you students, some students who I have had the pleasure of being in courses with years ago, some colleagues, and also the many international students and new students who have never been in the main buildings of the university before. So welcome. Okay, I have the boring academic job, which is to give you a little bit of background about what we're doing and why this is important. And we are on the eves of the midterms. Four of my sister Americans and I suspect there may be others, are here. We're talking about how we voted in our home states and what we're doing. Tomorrow is a really important day. And these midterms often get overseen, aren't really reported on, but they're terribly important and not just for US American politics. So why? These elections, midterms, and they're called mid because they're held in the middle of a four-term presidency. Presidents can be elected twice for a duration of 4 years. They are largely seen as a referendum on the president and on the party in power, that is what is decided on. Secondly, they entail a couple of really large elections, and then we have to go a little bit more into structures of US government and our so-called balance of power. There are two major elections. We have two Kammern, two houses in the American legislature. One is the House, and the smaller one is the Senate. And a huge number of smaller elections, for instance, for governors of state, also those who decide on how elections are run, something that we'll be coming back to. And there are a lot of ballot measures. We have 6 ballots that will be decided on tomorrow, and counting votes from abroad, like from some of my sister Americans here that will be counted next week. And they're about abortion bans, very important long term. As of tomorrow, all the members of the large legislative house, the House of Representatives, 435, this is based on numbers of people in the states, will be elected, and 34 of the 100 seats in the smaller legislative Kammer in the Senate. That's hugely important. And Laura, who's helping me, you'd be so good. Okay, again, why are they important? The House and the Senate, in our balance of powers between the executive, president, the legislative, the House of Representatives, and the Senate, and then the judiciary, the Supreme Court, and all the other courts, have these two houses of Congress have equal power. They have, for a new law to come into place, like the Voting Rights Act from 1965, we'll be talking about that more, both of the houses have to agree on it. Then the president has to sign this new law into being. The majority in a chamber, either in the House or in the Senate, has the power to stall or approve certain bills, to initiate impeachment proceedings, to take the president out of power who is sitting, and also, very important, something that's going to come up again and again, to confirm Senate nominations. Who becomes a Supreme Court justice? And arguably, this is something I said in 2016 when I wore black for 3 months because Trump had been elected. This is even more important than a president because our Supreme Court justices are nominated and become justices for life. Hence, they can largely determine US American politics for 40 years or more. Now we're getting to the two topics that we're trying to bring together tonight. What is the Supreme Court? Why is it so important in this election? And I'm seeing some of the students that I'm seeing here are from the law class, and some are from the diversity lecture. It's great that you're both here. The Democrats have the majority in the House of Representatives, 220 and 212, and there are 3 vacant seats. This election will decide if Democrats continue to have the majority or, as is feared, will lose the majority. There is no majority in the Senate because the Vice President can vote 2 whenever there is an undecided vote. At present, we have 48 Democrats and 50 Republicans and 2 independents. This will be incredibly important. If a Republican majority comes into the House of Representatives, we anticipate that the current President Joseph Biden will start to have impeachment proceedings put against him. A fundamental, he will be accused of illegal deeds, of working against the Constitution, and whatever else. This will make it very difficult for his government to run as an executive should in the next 2 years. It is also, and this is where it gets scary, as I've been mentioning to some of you, I have often written for the Frankfurter Rundschau in the past about American politics. I haven't wanted to recently because I haven't had anything particularly positive to say. It is a litmus test for Trump, and of course this isn't just Donald Trump, the former president, it's Trumpism in America, and the many forthcoming and upcoming little Trumps who could be named. And we also have here up for re-election as governors the quasi-president of the individual 50 states, two particularly, we would say in German, schrille Figuren, Greg Abbott, who tried to single-handedly put a piece of legislature that would equate parents helping their children to get gender-affirming health care with child abuse. This has been upheld for a while. And Ron DeSantis, famous in Florida, the governor, and also considered one of the most biggest contenders for the next presidency, and also competitors with Trump, who is best known for the Don't Say Gay bill, which makes it illegal for educators in Florida to talk about anything other than heteronormative, traditional married families. So, the Supreme Court. We have particularly the Dobbs decision, Dobbs versus Jackson's Women's Health Organization. This was the last place in the state of Mississippi where you could legally get an abortion. Very important. This decision has said that the right to abortion is not constitutional. And it overruled, very surprisingly, because the American legal system is based on the English one, in which case law and the precedent of a decision, not precedent, but precedent, a decision made in a former ruling usually becomes the law until and it's very difficult to change this. It overruled Roe versus Wade also from my childhood, which made abortion legal in all of the 50 states, and said that it is up to each of the states. More accurately, as I have written elsewhere, this is an abortion ban, and more accurately, it is also a form of forced birth. And the people whom it will hurt the most are not middle-class white women like myself. I'm now beyond the age of being able to bear children, but people who can get pregnant who have less means, because they will not be able to pay, to move, to get medication in order to get an abortion. This means a radical threat also to the health of all pregnant persons, because when there is an abortion ban in place, as we have in many states right now, it means that any woman with a difficult pregnancy, and pregnancy takes a huge toll on the pregnant person's life, she might have an ectopic pregnancy, a pregnancy that is in her fallopian tubes rather than in her uterus. She will not be able to get care or to end the pregnancy until the doctor in charge decides that she will literally die unless it happens. And women are starting to die because of this. With the history in the United States of slavery and Jim Crow, with indigenous women and black women both being enslaved women, subject to rape, coerced sexuality, forced birth, family separation, and in the era of Jim Crow, also to sterilizations against their will, This is an ugly, racist decision that affects not only the people of less means in the United States, but overwhelmingly also Black women, Indigenous women, and people of color. You can see it's not happy. In primary elections, and this is why this decision is so important for people who will be voting tomorrow, and for those of us, my sister Americans, who have voted in absentee voting ways, depending on our state, already. Because it has also motivated a huge new group to vote and to become politically active. In a primary election in Kansas, a very conservative state, a state that tends to vote Republican, and also in which this primary vote was expected to have a low turnout. And on the 2nd of August this year, a huge amount of new voters turned out to say that the abortion ban that was also to be voted on, that they would not support it. So we have a certain hope that Dobbs, which I see as a racist and also very economically motivated decision, will also motivate people to get involved. Okay. So, more on the importance. As I've mentioned with our government, we have, in what many regard as a radically undemocratic process, we have an overwhelming majority of extremely politically and socially conservative judges, now of the 9 on the Supreme Court. 3 of these Supreme Court judges were nominated and became Supreme Court justices during Trump's administration. For most viewers of democracy, this was radically unfair. One, while Obama was still in power, he was told with over a year before the election that he could not nominate a new justice because of the upcoming election and what was suspected that the Democrats would go out of power. However, when Ruth Bader Ginsburg died only within weeks of the presidential election, the overwhelmingly Republican Senate pushed through the nomination of Amy Barrett. And as you know, Kavanaugh, with a 3rd extremely conservative Supreme Court justice, was attacked, very credibly accused of sexual violence during his nomination hearings. Because of this, we have a historical low of US Americans who feel trust in the Supreme Court. And this is concerning because the balance of power is kept in place by a Supreme Court which decides whenever there are conflicts between the branches of government. And we have 2 cases coming up this term. They were already mentioned. One is on affirmative action, the historical movement that in governmental applications, but also in college applications. Excuse me, I'm going to have a drink of water. That those who belong to a historically discriminated against group should have, by the same qualifications, more of a chance of being admitted to college. We assume that this will be turned over. We already had a huge attack on the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which said that states could not individually put in place things that made it difficult for people to vote. This meant particularly Black voters and minority voters. We have another case coming up, and we assume that the states will be given more powers to turn voters away. If I think of my own experience as a Pennsylvania voter in a Republican-dominated state, I'm not moved to tears because of this. I'm also moved to tears because of it, but I'm moved to tears because of my persistent cough. It has become more difficult every 2 years to vote in Pennsylvania. It requires more time and effort. So why is this important for Germany? It's not just the United States, and this is a big question. As President Biden said recently, democracy is on the ballot this year. It really is important. We know about connections between MAGA Trumpists, between QAnon and Queerdenker, between the many conspiracy theorists, so virulent in right-wing politics, in anti-health legislation and regulations here in Germany, whose rhetoric and whose symbols are radically taken on from US America and from Trumpists. The conspiracy theories that surrounded Trump and Trumpism of a stolen election, a big lie, have led for many US Americans, but unfortunately not just US Americans, to a distrust of democratic processes and the election itself, which also affects us here in Germany. And finally, my last points. If a Trumpist comes back into power, just as Trump pulled out of the Paris Climate Accords, pulled out of any number of American alliances, things like NATO, which we need during the Ukraine war and beyond the Ukraine war, will also come into doubt. And finally, with a worldwide communication between far-right movements, anti-democratic movements in the United States will spell out and influence anti-democratic movements elsewhere. So, that's enough from me on the academic part, and now I'd like to introduce our star speaker. Dr. Michaela Dudley is a keynote speaker, a cabaret artist, an activist, and a doctor of law. She's a trans woman with African American roots, and as she has described herself, a colorful number among the dark figures. She works as a freelance translator and communications consultant for the language service Audimax, which she founded. Additionally, she is a columnist for Siegessäule Taz and Missy, amongst other publications. As a feminist gender activist and a diva in diversity, she is regularly asked to speak at universities and on TV and radio programs. She authored a non-fiction book about tango, a novel, the text of her own cabaret programs in German and English, and acts as a ghostwriter for Berlin Internet TV. She's also a jazz composer and a lyricist. Her book, and I can only recommend it, and I'm afraid that I forgot it on my desk at home, or I would pass it around, is Race Relations Essays über Rassismus. We also have a copy in the library, and it was published in February 2022. Please welcome Dr. Michaela Dudley.
Thank you so much. Can you hear me? Can you hear me? Sometimes I have to deal with microaggressions, as it were. So, yeah, thank you for the wonderful introductions here. I'm a woman without a period, but I was born with one hell of an exclamation mark, I'll put it that way. A trans woman, and I say that proudly from the bottom of my heart. You say in German, with the Brustton, aus dem Brustton tiefer überzeugt. So really proud trans woman, and it's coming from within, coming from the region we could refer to as Silicon Valley, perhaps. But not really. As she warned you, I do cabaret, so it's actually a topic or problematic today, which is really da gibt es nichts zu machen. It's really, you can hardly laugh at it or about it, and perhaps laughing at it or about it is part of the solution, but not just bending over and saying, okay, we had a good laugh, let's go back to being ignorant about everything. And I say that rather cynically because I was surprised that it was surprising for many people in the States when Dobbs came down, when Roe versus Wade was overturned. Now, there had been periods in my life, and I'd like to do some storytelling today and describe that, but basically, at some point I realized that Roe and other rulings from the Supreme Court were truly in danger. When you see how easily Trump was able to push his nominees for the Supreme Court through the justices. And by the way, there are no specific qualifications there. Actually, you don't even have to be a licensed attorney or a lawyer to get appointed. That's something that many people don't even know, including a lot of people in Congress until they get there. But it's been a very political process in the last decades among Republicans, and they've been doing it, much of it, beneath the radar, as it were, filling judge vacancies and judge vacancies at the state levels and the federal court levels, almost really with impunity, without anyone really noticing what was going on. I'd like to talk about that in detail a little bit later. But I was actually surprised that people were surprised. I mean, I was like, come on, people, where do you think you're living now? When you see how much vitriol is there in the so-called news programs of Fox News, which is really fake news in the truest sense. And Fox is not even the most right-wing of broadcasters there. There's One American Network, for example. There are a couple of others, Breitbart. I don't necessarily want to do advertising for them, but when you realize that Fox is not even the most extreme version, and when you look at Fox and you see people like Tucker Carlson spouting racist theories, replacement theory, you don't know about that, and just getting away with it, and then sponsors are like, yeah, you know, he has a big audience and he has a right to say that, free speech. Well, hatred is not covered by any constitution of any value. Hatred is not protected by free speech, but there's just been so much neglect or negligence on the part of the mainstream media, the true mainstream media in the last decades or so, not really calling things into question until it gets too late. As Greta said, for example, you have a situation where the midterm, I don't want to stand in the way, so or maybe I can go here, play a little something there too. As Greta said, the midterm elections in the States, even when the stakes are high, like the last time around, and the time before that, and the time before that, they tend not to get that much attention. A lot of voters are like, I'm not going outside unless there's a president on the ballot. But guess what? The president is always on the ballot, particularly in the years between those 4-year elections for president. Like you said, it's something of a referendum on how he's doing. I spent a lot of time in New York, and the former mayor of New York, Ed Koch, actually Koch, stuck in the middle, Koch, he'd always ask, how am I doing? How am I doing? Well, the midterm elections on the national level, where the Congress seats, where all Congress seats are up for grabs, and roughly a third of the Senate seats are extremely important. And, the news media haven't really been covering it in that context to say what's on the line. It's been more of a sensationalism. Look at all of what Trump is doing, and after he was finally gone, look at all of what's left over from what he's done, but not really looking forward and saying, okay, what is really in danger? People who tried to warn about that were just either dropped or silenced. Tone policing. One way of doing that, if you have a political show, is your contract won't get renewed. All right, that's a form of tone policing. So ask Tiffany Cross. She was a favorite of mine. She still is a black moderator by MSNBC. She had weekends on Saturday. The second most popular cable show in MSNBC. A black woman, very outspoken, very independent thinking, and that's the kind of person which Tucker Carlson doesn't really want to see in television, so he puts out his criticism of her, suggesting she wants to get rid of white people and all these kinds of things. It took days for MSNBC to even remotely support her and say, well, we're standing by her. Right? It was hard for them to do that. It was much easier for them to drop her, and that's what they did. They dropped her last Friday, the day before her show, barely 5 days before the election. You see these kinds of things, and you wonder why the Republicans, the Trump Republicans, can be so successful at what they do when it should be obvious to everyone what kind of dangerous service that is. But when you see how mainstream news media and supposedly news media left from the center just kind of lay down and let the Republicans walk all over them. And many Americans, I know there's several over here, many Americans aren't all that well versed in the political situation there. Like I said, many aren't really interested in midterm elections. They don't quite know what it is. They know when someone is up for the presidency, okay, if you pull hard enough, they'll get out there and vote. But everything else, they kind of let it happen. And what happens? Republicans come in. They're not concentrating only on the upper levels, president, vice president, who might be Speaker of the House, for example, the third in line, the third in succession. Currently, Nancy Pelosi, whose husband in his 80s is recovering from a fractured skull because their house in San Francisco was invaded by one of these MAGA idiots who tried to kill her husband due to political reasons. And you don't see the Republicans really condemning that. You do see one of Trump's sons going around telling jokes about an old man getting his head bashed in. That's the kind of environment which is there. And there's a lot of, like I said, the cable news networks are keen to cover these sensationalist aspects of it. Always breaking news when something happens, just like when there's a shooting, a school shooting somewhere. So many school shootings there, they're starting to ask the kids to plan these shootings in advance so they can cover them properly. But they let things happen. And so Republicans are very active at the local level. You know the terminology, or you know the phrase, all politics are local. They take that to heart. So they are very concerned with who's on the school board. They're very concerned with the individual states, quasi-Bundesstaaten. They're very concerned with who gets to be elected to Secretary of State. Now, don't confuse that title with the Federal Secretary of State. The Federal Secretary of State is essentially the foreign minister, if you will. But the Secretaries of State in the individual federal states there, they're the ones, their most significant function is supervising the elections. supervising the elections, at the very least every 2 years, and sometimes there's special elections when someone, dies in office, or when someone has to be replaced, when some politician is sent to prison. It happens occasionally, right? So even then, they're involved in that, and you say, okay, good. So they supervise. But in the last few years, supervision has been interpreted rather by the conservatives rather liberally. Supervision means allowing intimidation. Supervision means allowing people to get confused by saying, oh, we have a new requirement if you want to vote. Just fill out this form, fill it out properly, right? And don't forget a copy of your ID. And it's not like here where you have an ID. In many states, a driver's license will suffice. There's even a so-called non-driver's license for people who don't drive, so that it's okay to have an ID. But there's always a question of which ID you send, and these kinds of things. And there's so many possibilities for goodwill voters to make mistakes, particularly older voters. And but that's all part of the calculation there, isn't it? They want to complicate it. They want to make it more difficult. They want to confuse. And they also want to leave room for them to say, well, sorry, but is that it? Did you sign that with a blue pen? It's supposed to be black, right? Next time around, 2 years, come back again. And if that sounds funny, if it sounds exaggerated, it's not. Let me tell you a little bit about myself. Yeah, I was born, I saw the light of the world 1961. I saw the light of the world in the shadow of the Statue of Liberty. The American dream, the land of unlimited opportunities, right? Nothing is impossible if you're white, male, and affluent, right? But the dreamland is also a land of trauma for a lot of people who want to be a part of that, I've been looking at the ass of the woman on the Statue of Liberty for a long time, and I said, I'd like to know what it's like to get up on that pedestal. She's waving everybody else into the country, who's not black, and that seems like a powerful position. I didn't realize that she was also, if you will, a victim of misogyny, leaving that task for a woman to do it. Anything which people complain, it's a woman or it's a minority. But at any rate, you grow up in a country like that, and I was an eager kid, a career kid, trying to figure out who the hell I was. I knew that I was black. A lot of white people told me that with certain words, right? And I thought maybe I can make it too. And that's one of the many things I have in my book. It's written in German. It's called Race Relations, Essays, Racism. It's written in German, and people ask me, when are you going to write it in English? I would like to read maybe like one page of it in German, because there are people here who actually speak German too. Just as a matter of inclusion, for example. At some point I will write it in English as well, but it's not something, although I do professionally translate, it's not something you can just translate, one to one. It has a lot of alliterations in it and so forth. But I would like to read that in covering racism. But I describe in that book what it's like, because I was conceived by my parents. They were watching television, or trying to watch television. One of these old black and white televisions with the antennas, you remember that? Yeah, okay. Where you had to turn them and like, if it was full moon, raise your right leg and hope for the best. It was really awful. And there were like three television stations. You had the whole dial for like 3 television. not like today where you have hundreds and hundreds. And they were watching the inauguration. Well, they weren't watching it entirely, unfortunately. They decided to do something else too. They were in bed, right? And the reception wasn't all that good, so they started fooling around. I wasn't there yet, but I was at gleaming the eye of my mother. So I'm glad the reception wasn't all that good. Otherwise I wouldn't be here now, maybe later, I don't know. Yeah, black and white. When a young president-elect raised his hand and swore on the Bible, like any good American does, swear on the Bible, and gave a speech. No, it wasn't Obama. It was a very elegant man, still, but it wasn't Obama. It was John F. Kennedy, and that was his famous speech where he also said, ask not what you can do for your country, but what your country can do for you. And talking about the liberties which had to be expanded in the country. And he was very lucky to have been elected. He was a Democrat from Massachusetts. And they weren't particularly liked by Democrats in the South, the so-called Dixiecrats in Dixieland. The Dixie Democrats were often more conservative than the Southern Republicans. It's hard to imagine when you tell people that they don't understand. That's why you need to talk to let people like me talk about it. I lived through that shit. I know what it's like. I know what it's like seeing a Democrat governor like George Wallace standing at the entrance to the university and saying, segregation now, segregation forever. A Democrat, right? So that's kind of the environment there at the time, that because of limited support in the party itself, it was a rather close election. But what does a close election mean in a country where you have two forms of tallying votes? You have the popular vote, and then you have this shit called the Electoral College, which kind of says, wait a minute, that's what the people want. But let us have a word there, right? I don't know if we have time to talk about the Electoral College. It's one of those mysteries, you know. It's seemingly enigmatic, but basically it is, in my opinion, anti-democratic, because the popular vote has to watch and say, well, these guys in the Electoral College get to decide. That's also a reason why Republicans want to take control of the states, governors and so forth. Who do you think appoints all of these officials which carry out these actually innocuous tasks of counting votes and supervising it? We can even get to Mike Pence and why the Republicans wanted to hang him. Because he limited his activity to what he was supposed to do, just certify the vote. Not send it back to be recounted until they get it right, but just certify the vote. So, talking about all of these things, so at the beginning of the 1960s, when I was born, there was this, it was like being between, it was like being on the verge of an apocalypse, but also being on the verge of progress, And many people believed Kennedy could do the job. He had the support of black civil rights leaders and so forth. He promised reforms in election matters and so forth. He didn't get to live to see that. His predecessor, Lyndon B. Johnson, had the honor of doing that. But I just want to say why I mention all of these things in the part of, after that great speech at the inauguration, it was basically, you saw the, how should I say, the gap between reality and, if you will, propaganda. Kennedy was talking about racial justice, but then, and there was a lot of snow in Washington at that time. There was a big blizzard and they had to plow the snow away. Somehow, he just didn't scrape away the snow at 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue. because he let his father, Joseph Kennedy, say, no, that boy isn't coming here. That boy is Sammy Davis Jr., who John F. Kennedy wanted there to perform. He was Mr. Entertainment. The black guy converted to Judaism. He had served in the army, entertaining troops. Basically, bounced from Harlem to Hollywood, wherever he was successful, actually the American dream. But Joseph Kennedy, the father of Dick, said, no, we don't want him here, because he was afraid that would upset the Southern Democrats. Sammy Davis Jr. was with a white woman, and that was taboo. I'm mentioning these things to try to paint a picture of what it was like. And I also remember when LBJ, Lyndon Johnson, signed the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act, which on 64 and 65, I was still crawling around on the floor. I remember how my mother and my aunts, they all put on their Sunday best, because there was an American president validating our right to vote, which we already had through the Constitution, and validating it barely 100 years, barely just 1 century after the end of the Civil War, which was fought supposedly to end slavery. So it only took a century for the voting right to get extended, or let's say explicitly mentioned. So you see, I'm being a bit sarcastic there, but all of these major events happen at a snail's pace. And that's why my mother and my aunts, and I have a similar picture of that in the book, showing black women and black men just getting dressed up like they're going to church on Sunday, because it's a special day for them. And guess what? They had been doing that anyway. They had been getting up on that second Tuesday in November, the traditional voting day in the United States, and going to the polls in the South to vote, early 60s, and they were turned away. Or they were given the so-called poll tax. They had to pay a small tax, pay a small fee to vote, which was unconstitutional. But when you're a Southern sheriff there, you make sure that there's enough people there who can enforce this unlawful act. And so black people were often turned away, or they had to guess the number of jelly beans. You know what jelly beans are? They candy things in a jar. Like they could have been 200, 300, I don't know. Nobody knew, not even the ones administering the election. If, for example, the black person who was ordered to guess the number of jelly beans happened to get the right number, there would have been no way to verify that either. So it's basically saying, go home, you N-words. There's nothing for you to do here. And so good. So we had the Voting Rights Act, 64 and 65 civil rights and everything. So everything should be on the right path, right? So let me go a little fast forward to 1967. I was with my parents. We traveled down from the north down to the south in Tennessee, where the father's side of my family came from. That was a Protestant side. My mother was Catholic, and my father converted to Catholicism. I was actually baptized Catholic, I think, still in the womb. When I came out, I was praying. So the paternal grandfather was a preacher, African Methodist American Church in Tennessee, and in a small town there. And we were visiting there, and I remember we had the Green Book. If you don't know what the Green Book is, read my book. It's the black book with my picture on it. The Green Book it was named after Victor Hugo Green, a publisher, and it was often in a green color too. It was basically a travel guide for Black Americans who wanted to discover their own country, or wanted to do so south of the Mason-Dixon line, so in the South in Dixieland. And it was saying all the places which they were allowed to stay. Because there were so many more places they weren't allowed to stay in. Hotels, you couldn't stay there, but many restaurants, you couldn't just walk in there and sit down. If you were lucky, they wouldn't violently throw you out, but they would give you a bill for like a hamburger or something. I'm a vegan, but at that time, but for like a small snack, they would give you a bill for like $50 in the 60s, just to make sure you never come back. And of course, you didn't pay it, they called the sheriff. But usually it was a good idea not to challenge that anyway, just to go to the Black-only places. I got a lot of pictures of that in my book, a lot of descriptions of that. And it's something which I almost found it to be normal at the time. Like I said, we lived in the North, where the racism was less overt, not necessarily free of violence, but less overt, less institutionalized in that sense. But it was like another dimension being in the South in the 60s. So we had this green book to tell you where to go. I didn't realize it at the time. It took me much later in life to realize it. That, we call that Jim Crow segregation. If you heard the term Jim Crow, my book explains who and what Jim Crow was. I recommend some sisters here in Germany who maybe are half as old as I am, who just write one book about racism after another. If they don't have any ideas left, they take the scissors out and they go up to the Charter of Diversity and cut things out and paste them there. I recommend that they do that too, because I talked to one or two of these best-selling authors. I won't mention any names, but if I had to explain to them what Jim Crow is, they don't need to be writing books about racism. Jim Crow is something which influenced Germany. We're talking about, the nexus between the States and Germany. Well, get this, Jim Crow, so the law, the segregation laws, which came up after the Civil War, after the freeing of the slaves, when the southern states tried to regain their glory. Jim Crow saying, Black people can't eat here, they can't go shopping there, and all those kinds of things. Guess what? That was inspiring for a group of young jurists, a group of young lawyers in Berlin in the early 1930s who were busy drafting the Nuremberg laws. I cite correspondence from some of these Nazi judges, like Roland Weisenberg and so forth. Some of the most vicious, vile individuals ever to wear a black robe. Some of them made it up to the Volksgerichtshof here, basically the judicial death chamber. In the early 30s, they were so inspired by American Jim Crow. The way that white people in the United States, including a lot of people who came from German-speaking countries, but the way white people there were able to keep black people and other people of color down by law. In spite of all of these lofty, U.S. constitutional promises and promulgations about every man being equal, and all of these lofty things, that it was still possible in such a large country to basically enslave other people or to get them to relinquish their property, their rights, because that's what they were planning to do with the Jews, for example, and anyone else who got in their way during their course of expansion. And of course, there was also inspiration for the apartheid fanatics in South Africa. In the 40s, a lot of people didn't have that on the radar because South Africa was always a colony of someone. Apartheid in itself wasn't all that old, actually. Slavery was, and the remnants of it. But those who drafted the apartheid laws, the race laws there in South Africa, were also very inspired by that. So there's a lot of reason for people here in Germany who study racism or anti-racism, and particularly those who believe they can write a book about it, to know something about that. Some of them don't even know anything about the Heidelberg text. You can say, okay, Michaela, that's too much American stuff. Let's focus on Germany when people are writing books in Germany about racism. But a lot of these best-selling authors don't know what the Heidelberg texts were either. That was long before Thilo Sarrazin. There's just a couple of points, just a couple of, friendly tips there with the elbow. But even with myself, it took me a long time to realize that I had spent my youth, I'd seen Germany already in my youth too. My father was by the Air Force and a lot of other people in the family in Germany, West Germany, West Berlin. So, but most of my youth in the States. It took me a long time to realize that I'd spent my youth in an apartheid state. It was just difficult for me to realize that because you get all of this hype, like I said, seeing the acts of the Statue of Liberty and all of these celebrations, all of these patriotic calendar days and so forth, and you're always thinking, we too, as marginalized people, we are on the verge of finally getting there, right? We just hold out a little bit more. Don't be too angry, but don't give up hope. And somehow they'll give us what we actually need to just grab out of their freaking hands, right? And it took me a long time. Why am I saying all of this? No matter which system we grew up in, we tend to get comfortable with discomfort. We tend to think, okay, there's a reason for that. Let's get politically active. And then you get politically active and then get politically disenfranchised because you see, well, it's not just that sphere in which things are going on. And then you start realizing what intersectionality is on the societal level as well. There's so many connections there. I have to say, it's astonishing to see how much effort is made to hold up a system of racial and social and sexual oppression, because many of them holding it up themselves are getting very, very few privileges from it. But nevertheless, they're part of it. And at any rate, just voting is unfortunately not the entire answer. A lot of people think, okay, yeah, I'll do my patriotic duty. Those lazy MFs over there, they don't go voting. They don't go voting in midterms, maybe not even the presidency. I'll go voting this year and in 2 years. Great, but what do you do in between? What the hell do you do in between? Are you watching what's developing there? Are you thinking maybe about possibly getting involved yourself? You don't have to run for office to be a congressman or a state senator, but maybe the school board. Maybe the school board, because you know what? In Texas, Greg Abbott in Texas, or on his watch at least, there are people in communities there who are seriously making efforts to either ban books about the Holocaust or to say if they're in libraries, and they're in school libraries, there have to be books with a second opinion about the Holocaust. Look it up, Google it. So it's no wonder that in a state like Florida, Ron DeSantis, that he feels emboldened to do things like don't say gay, right? Because if you don't say gay, then there won't be any queers like me, right? So, but he feels emboldened to want to ban books about slavery. Why would anyone want to ban a book about slavery? Either whether it's Uncle Tom's Cabin, a novel, or whether it's a nonfiction book. Why? What interest could someone have in wanting to ban a book about slavery or about the Holocaust? Who would want to do that? And who would want to support those who do that? At some point, you have to use the N word. You have to say that's Nazism. But what else is it? It's nuts, it's crazy, but it's also methodical. And I guess I'm getting non-academic now, I'm getting emotional, but I'm trying to, portray really what's going on, and what's been going on. I'll make a fast forward again. A few weeks ago in Berlin, I finally met her. Angela Davis. I've been going through my whole life hoping to see her. There was some close calls. When I was in California and she was teaching there and all this stuff. But I remember a day in 1971, my older cousin, female cousin, whose girl clothes I'd been trying on, secretly trying on. She knew about it. Even my grandmother knew about it, but not too many people knew about it, right? She came up to me. She had one of these buttons, with a picture of someone. It was a picture of Angela Davis, and it said "Free Angela," and it was the announcement of a demo in Central Park. And she came up to me and pinned it on and said, "Come, we're going to a demonstration." I said, wait. I was like, 10 years old, 9 years old? That wasn't my first. I talked on the night after Martin Luther King had been shot in '68. My parents took me onto the streets for like a vigil. A silent protest, as it were. But that had been broken up by the police, who were afraid of it spilling over into violence. So my first real demo was then when I went with my cousin in Central Park. I was really a little bit apprehensive because we heard these things about Angela Davis. Even some members of my family said, she's a communist. And one of these radicals, Black Panther, things like that. I could talk all day about my almost accidental connections with Black Panthers and so on. But anyway, I was afraid something might happen, but she encouraged me to go because she said, she promised if I would go with her, she would make sure no one found out that I was wearing girls' clothes, right? So that worked. Later when I studied law, I realized that was basically blackmail. Even though I saw myself maybe not as black male, black female, black non-binary, whatever. But, so I don't know. So I told Angela about that like 4 weeks ago in Berlin. We met at Oranienplatz. That's a site of a refugee camp, as it were, but not where they're housed, but where people can receive information about what's going on, in the situation, how they can receive help and all those kinds of things. So she was there for like the 10th anniversary. And of course she reads German, she spent some time in Germany, met German political leaders, even in West Germany too, during her days after she was on the run. And I asked her, what was it like? What's it like for her? She's 17 years older than I am. That's not much. But those 17 years, what the hell of a difference that made. I mean, before she was even 30, she had been through hell and back, right? And I said, you know, you, just like I, we've lived through all of these things. The Civil Rights Act, Stonewall, you know, we're talking about queer rights and things like that. I lived through that too. I was like 7 or 8 years old. There wasn't much coverage in television. It was like censored, but you still found out about it. I asked my grandmother, astonishingly world open, as it were, what does homosexual mean? And this other word, transsexual, she was surprised, but she explained to me, without moralizing, you know, what it was, in a manner appropriate for a child. I thought, wow, these people there are on the streets for me, you know, because I felt, hey, I'm different too, I'm like that. And I was thinking, when I'm in their age, I don't have to do this stuff, you know, behind closed doors. As it were, having lived through that, 10 years later, I found out who the hell Marsha P. Johnson was for the first time. She's the one who threw the first Stonewall. She and Sylvia Rivera are regarded as two of the heroes of that, a Latina and a black woman. People of color at the forefront, trans women, and yet ignored by feminists, by white mainstream feminists, ignored by white mainstream queer activists and so forth. That's another story, but I just want to mention that. I remember when Roe versus Wade was passed, 1973, and seeing all of these women jumping up and down the streets, saying finally, you know, all of these things. I served as an officer in the Navy, imagine that. But at that time I did, homosexuality, let alone transsexuality, was forbidden. You could go to jail, you could go to the stockade, you could go in the psychiatric ward, or any of the above. So in my day, I had to keep all of that secret, right? And then I was pleased to see and a bit jealous when Obama finally got around to, you know, making sure trans rights were part of military life, because Bill Clinton's, you know, don't ask, don't tell, that wasn't it. So you see, in the course of 50 years, all of these advancements being made, Angela, and then what's it like? On the heels of a black president leaving office, a fascist comes in with a couple of tweets and a couple of signatures, throws everything back a half century. And you know what she said? She said something that another Angela says, or Angela, in a different context. She said, it's without an alternative. It's alternativos. As Angela Davis said it, she didn't do that. Right? But you can't just do a miracle. But, and she's right. You know, one of her famous, and I'll wrap it up now, one of her famous quotes is also in my book. Freedom is a continuous battle. And that means, sorry for saying it so bluntly, don't lay down on your ass after you win the vote. You'd be proud of having gone to vote. But make sure you follow what's going on, you know, to the next election. Think about running for that school board position, or think about supporting someone else who's planning to run for office. You know, you need a long advance there to do that. Get involved. Use the social media, for God's sakes, for something good, for change, right? Communicate and do all of these things. And then, even then when you say, we don't have a chance, still don't give up. Because one of the reasons the Republicans keep doing this nonsense, they know they can't always force recounts. Even though Trump appointed a lot of these judges and justices making these making his decisions on the merits in other cases like abortion, like what appears to be shaping up with affirmative action and so forth. Many of them have nevertheless been reluctant to support him in wanting to get recounts. That's an interesting point, by the way. That's suggesting that maybe that would be going too far. He and his cronies have filed 61, like one lawsuit for each year of my life, 61 lawsuits trying to get votes recounted basically until he gets the result that he wants. 61 lawsuits. 60 of them were turned down. 60, and the one which he won, per se, ultimately didn't help him anyway. As it turned out, there was a recount, and he had even less votes than originally. So why are they doing this shit? They're in it for the long game. My book is entitled Race Relations, and it's in German, but so why did I use race? It's a double entendre, race in terms of that controversial word, Rasse, in Germany verpönt, and in the USA, in Germany verpönt, in the States, on the other hand, here seen as a vehicle or medium towards empowerment. Race, black, okay, great, no problem. But whatever, it's a race, it's a running. Like people run for office, it's also running for justice. And it's not a sprint. And for many of us, it's a marathon with barricades we have to jump over. But the Republicans are in it for the long game. They want us to get exhausted. They know damn well that even the judges, some of the judges which they appointed, aren't going to go that far and give them all of what they want, but they want us to get tired. They want us to get disgusted and disenfranchised and just give up so that they can vote, and maybe they wouldn't even have to cheat and still win. That's what they want. That's part of the strategy. And if you look at what happened, with women's rights, or the rights of people who give birth to children, people who can get pregnant, looking at it in an inclusive manner now. Or for that matter, Roe versus Wade and Dobbs. Dobbs is something which theoretically also impacts upon, let's say, cis-heteronormative men, upon the fathers too. There are a lot of fathers, including a lot of minority or black fathers, fathers of color. And it's not a joke. There was a joke about Herschel Walker on this one, but it's not a joke. A lot of them are worried about child support. I mean, if you start twisting and turning abortion laws and saying, the life begins at the moment of conception, what does that mean for child support? Think about it. And so there's a lot at stake here in these elections, and because of the influence of what happens in America, because of that influence around the world, either directly or indirectly, it's really important to pay attention to that. The area, because women's rights, queer rights, civil rights, environmental rights, and it's all intersectional. That's why you get terms like environmental racism, for example, and so forth and so on. So I'll stop talking now, because there's someone else here who has a lot of wonderful things to say. But if you guys and gals also have any questions, I'm happy to respond. Thank you.
Despite the fact that they're not going to turn off the heating supposedly till 6 o'clock, I'm finding it really cold in here. Everybody else seems to put on a blanket.
Thank you so much, Dr. Dudley. And there is much to say and much to ask, and we'll open up to questions and answers auf Deutsch oder auf English momentarily. It's now, though, because, and Dr. Dudley opened the way, the effective Dobbs are not just abortion ban, forced birth. They are all sorts of civil rights in the United States. And this is a topic that Laura Borchert, soon to defend her dissertation, knows a lot about because she's been working on it for many, many years. Laura is an academic activist whose research is situated in queer legal theory, law, and other topics, and American cultural studies. She works as a research assistant at the English department at the University of Gießen. In her PhD manuscript, Beyond Bostock, another important case for gay rights, Towards the New Queer Rights, she analyzed how sexual orientation is constitutionally protected in the US as a legal cultural category and how law and culture constitute queer subjects. She is currently a postdoc researcher in the DFG-funded project Menschenrechtsdiskurse in der Migrationsgesellschaft, and you can find her and her work on Twitter and on Academia Edu. Please join me in welcoming Laura.
Is that fine? Can you hear me? It's a little quiet. Okay. We'll try to speak up a bit. Thank you, Greta, and thank you, Dr. Radley. I really like the way you told us about your experiences and also showed us how law and politics affect all of us really on a personal level too. What I found interesting is that you said, well, we see that certain legal norms and political ideas from the US also affect Germany, as you said, with regard to Jim Crow and the Nuremberg laws. And in the US we also see that many anti-queer bills really travel from one conservative state to another. We see that especially with Florida's Ron DeSantis and also Texas Greg Abbott. So we see how different conservative politicians really influence and try to copy each other in their hostile attempts at queer realities. So thanks again for reminding us that this is something that has been historically going on. I also feel with you that you said it comes as a surprise that people feel surprised that Dobbs happened. And I also think this was a gradual process and people could really witness how conservative politicians and lawmakers try to, curl back, overturn minority rights, and it's still going on. And Greta, you told us about Kavanaugh, which was one of the first, basically, attempts to get a very contested figure on the Supreme Court, very medialized event, and obviously then when Ruth Bader Ginsburg died. So the Supreme Court is at a historical low in trust, but nonetheless continues to become more of a political player in the US. And we see that now with Dobbs, it's not just reproductive rights that are at stake, but basically all kind of minority rights. We heard about affirmative action, voting rights, but in the Dobbs decision, it really becomes clear that Clarence Thomas says, well, we have a duty to correct these errors that has been established. Thank you. Yeah. Sorry. We see Clarence Thomas says, well, there are former decisions, and we need to look again at those decisions because those decisions have been mistakes. And so when we say the Supreme Court is coming for queer rights next, it's not just a horror scenario people make up or a panic. It's something that justices say that they will do. And this is not the first time that they basically foreshadow what they want to do. As early as 2020, Clarence Thomas and Samuel Alito have already said, well, Obergefell, the decision that legalized same-sex marriage in the US, needs to be looked at again, reviewed, because in their opinion, this decision was undemocratic made. Because they say, well, we as a Supreme Court, we are not elected officials, so when we make a decision, it is not democratic. And all of these really fundamental decisions need to go through the people. So they need to go through the legislative. And this is interesting because the Supreme Court, on the one hand, aims to gut the Voting Rights Act, which they did in 2010, and work towards voter suppression. So they aim to, hurt those democratic structures. But on the other hand, when it comes to minority rights, they say, no, we need to overturn that decision because it was not democratic enough. So we see some kind of a paradox here. And what Dobbs shows is that, talking about precedents, former decisions, none of these decisions are really secure. And Dr. Dudley, you said freedom is a continuous battle, and well, also the fighting for queer rights and minority rights is a continuous battle. Because as we see, they are all up for grabs whenever the political climate is changing. So it is really a hostile environment for queer rights and minority rights right now, I would say. What is interesting, what I found also in my research, is that we see a strong identification and emphasis on the Constitution. So while the Supreme Court may be, lacking in trust and is trying to gain more political power, we see that many politicians claim that the Constitution, or that something is a constitutional right and the Constitution is on their side. And also during these midterms, there were many conservative Republicans, Carrie Lake for instance, and they say, well, we're not living in a democracy, the US is not a democracy, it's a constitutional republic. And they really stress that they act according to the principles laid down in the Constitution. So the Constitution is really at the core of what they believe or they imagine the legal system to be like. And this emphasis on the Constitution also puts minorities out of the picture, because they say the Constitution did not mention queer rights. How could it? And if it is not mentioned there, basically it's not very American. We take the power back to the states, they can deal with these issues, but the Constitution does not say anything about queer rights, so let's leave them out of the protection. And I think that's a very dangerous development we're seeing there. So I think you're right that you say, well, it's a run for justice and something we need to work towards and continue the efforts to also educate about these issues. And many of the things we see that the Supreme Court is doing is also invisibilizing their actions. One thing, I think you also mentioned the Thomases in your book, Juni and Clarence. So
I mentioned it in correspondence. Not in the book, but I mentioned it in correspondence. In advance of this event. It's very interesting. This couple, Juni and Clarence Thomas. I say is a quite interesting white couple. That's another side remark or snide remark. Clarence Thomas is of course officially black, right? There's an interesting couple of ironies here. The older ones of you might remember a certain black law professor, Anita Hill, at the beginning of the 90s. She was respected in her academic field, but she gained national prominence when she testified against Clarence Thomas. Clarence Thomas had just been nominated to be the next US Supreme Court Justice, nominated by Bush Sr. Up until then, Clarence Thomas was equal opportunity head, and had some minor positions, so that would have been like a a quantum leap on the Supreme Court as only the second black person, after Thurgood Marshall, the great Thurgood Marshall. But Clarence Thomas had something of a Kavanaugh issue too. Claims by women that he had sexually harassed them, at least, and some of them I found to be quite credible on their own merit. At any rate, a certain head of the Senate Judiciary Committee, the Senate Judiciary Committee receives these nominees and has the power to confirm them to the Supreme Court. And the head of this committee was a Democrat, a white Democrat from Delaware, and originally from Scranton, Pennsylvania. He was in charge of it, and he bent over backwards, way backwards, to be fair, because he was already then something of an old white man, and he was still young. He wanted to show, basically, that he was not going to stand in the way of the second black justice of the Supreme Court. So he gave Anita Hill a chance to testify against him, but he limited, didn't testify, against Clarence Thomas, but he limited the number of other women who can do that and so forth. And this person, this head of the committee, was Joe Biden, who later who's the president now, at least until the next 2 years. So there's a certain degree, there's a certain irony in that matter. At any rate, Clarence Thomas soon proved himself to be quite conservative. Perhaps the most conservative justice on the Supreme Court. We talk about people like Alito and so on, but consistently conservative. This man has really an attitude against affirmative action. If you ask me, it has to do with his days at Yale, where he was taunted and teased while they thought him to be the token black, and somehow he couldn't, deal with that. If you want to see an interesting series, an interesting show, it's in English, just Google Roland Martin Unfiltered. That's a network, and on that network, a YouTube network, there's a show called The Black Table. The Black Table with Greg Carr. He's a professor, head of Black Studies at Howard University. It's the Harvard of the Black community. And he had a white guest on who talked about the evolution, or devolution, if you will, of Clarence Thomas, of how a black man could come to be like that. Anyway, Clarence Thomas is married to a white woman, Virginia Thomas, Ginny, and this woman is very actively involved with fringe elements of the Republican Party who were, involved in these conspiracy theories, and some of them the wildest. And she's so involved that she recently was compelled to testify before the House committee, which is investigating that 6th January of last year, Dry Königs Tag, when I call it the Ku Klux Klan, Ku Se-O-U-Pe, Klux Klan, when these MAGA idiots tried to take over the Capitol, stop the counting of the votes, and they were willing to hang Mike Pence, their vice president, just to get it done. So that's the kind of connection. So she has these connections, and she's in the, politics has strange bedfellows.
Let's get her wrap it up because we want to turn over to the audience.
Right, and so she is doing that while her husband is sitting on the Supreme Court. Think about that.
Okay, I'm going to ask Laura if you want to finish up, and then it's a time for you. We've had 3 very different kinds of inputs for you to say, haben Sie Fragen oder Kommentaren, or questions, because some of this was very specific and historic and also legal, Some of it was much broader. Laura, were you finished?
Yeah, thank you.
Okay.
Thanks, Dr.
Okay. Okay. How about from your side? Other than that, it's very cold. Felix.
Yeah, there are so many comments that I would have, but I'm trying to keep it short to give others the opportunity to ask questions or give comments. There was one. There was one thing that you said that really stuck with me was these peoples are on the streets for me. Because I'm a fellow trans person, I'm a trans man, and you know that it's such a profound quote because you followed it up with, and I think you said something along those lines of, and I thought that I would never have to go, I would never have to hide, and I would never have to do that. And obviously we are still in a position where we sadly have to go on the streets, and we have to continue to do so. And that ties back to that quote from Angela Davis, freedom is a continuous effort. And I think it's sad that we have to do that, but it also shows that we have a fighting spirit, and it ties into everything, into you know, people of any sort of ethnic background or global background or whatever, people of any sort of class or gender or whatever, they will have to continue to go on the streets. And not only on the streets, because not everyone can, but take it on the streets, take it to social media. And I just wanted to thank you also for being here today and for sharing your story and for sharing so many profound things. Thank you.
Felix, that's very kind of you. I appreciate that. That touches me. Yes, that's the gist of what I was saying. Get active, remain motivated. The German phrase of my book comes from me. It's die Entmenschlichung fängt mit dem Wort an, die Emanzipierung aber auch. So the dehumanization begins with the vocabulary, but also freedom does too. We just have to start. We have to start telling the truth, seeking the truth, telling the truth. And realizing what's at stake and communicating with each other. The issue of, I was really saying, I remember in 1969, that fateful summer, you know, the demonstrations against the war in Vietnam, for civil rights still, Woodstock, the landing on the moon, the sky was the limit. It seemed like everything was possible. And when I found about this uprising in a small bar in Christopher Street in Greenwich Village, I wasn't even in the puberty, but I knew I was queer, right? And I thought, wow, that's what these people are doing, and they're doing it for me, you know. And when I'm in their age, everything will be clear, you know. But now we seem to be a clear and present danger for a lot of people. And they would love to see us go back into the closets or into the jails or into the psycho wards, where a lot of us do land in the psychiatric ward, and that's pitiful because we're not sick, it's society that is sick. Part of the disappointment, and then I'll wrap it up, but I just want to say things too, because I know some people here who are involved in thankfully, in questioning and criticizing white-dominated feminism, not white feminism, but white-dominated feminism. And I had to mention how two people of color like Marsha P. Johnson, who I sang a song about in television, Kulturpolitik and dry stuff. If you write Instagram, follow me, then you can see all of these things. I won't have to take up our time talking about that. Michaela.Dudley, Unterstrich official. But these people, you know, Marsha P. Johnson, Sylvia Rivera, they didn't know much about politics, but they were real activists. They started community activism there, and they were just pushed aside by the mainstream feminists and mainstream gay rights advocates. And so let's do a fast forward to today. How could that happen with Dobbs, for example? My opinion is the feminist community in the States is nearly as divided as it was then. There's hardly any communication between them. Intersectionality is like a utopian phrase or term. But if we unite, if white sisters who might be able to afford to fly to another country to have an abortion unite with sisters of color, we can all stand up. We can say, well, the white sisters, why would they have to do that? What would motivate them? If they have the money to go somewhere else for an abortion. Well, look at it this way. It's not just about their privileges. They too can lose their privileges. Why are so many white women suddenly deleting their online and app-based period data about their menstruation, for example? Because they're scared shitless about being hauled into jail in a state run by someone like Ron DeSantis or Greg Abbott. So they have to realize that even though they have their few privileges, they're next. All of us are next. You all know this famous poem about, they came for the communists, I didn't say anything. They came for the socialists, I didn't say anything. They came for the Jews, whatever, I didn't say anything. Then they came for me and nobody was left. That's still relevant.
Very powerful.
Yes.
Thanks for sharing many things with us. Also very personal.
You're too quiet. If you could speak right into it.
Yeah, I want to thank you for sharing these also very personal things with us, so that we could get a really close look. A question that something that really stuck with me was that you said at one point that you had to be, when you were older, you had to live through your youth to realize how racist the system in the US is. And one thing that instantly came up for me, you now live in Germany, you write in German, you write your German books in German, so it's like something, this is also a kind of a side question, why you write in German. But my main question is, do you also, how much of this political culture you experienced in the US with the Supreme Court doing greatly influencing social politics, how much of this are you seeing in German, or how much of in Germany, how much of the dynamics that you explained or talked about, which are happening in the US, the racist dynamics from Supreme Court and social dynamics, and all of this, how much of these tendencies do you see in Germany as a person from America living in Germany?
Well, thank you. What's your name, if I may ask? Max. Thank you, Max. Those are great questions. I'll try to answer them succinctly because Greta is getting cold. She just went to the park. I've not intellectually, but optically, I'm a little short-sighted. So with my other glasses here. Yeah, great. Can you see me better now? Okay, that was only for effect. Oh, those are great questions. First of all, why do I write in German? Well, I learned German. Both of my parents are Black Americans. I was born in the States. Incidentally, in the same year, 1961, in Berlin, in which the wall was built. And I've always had the feeling, or later in life, I had the feeling constantly to having to break through walls, with my head, and it hurts. You need a lot of, when you do that, you need a lot of aspiration, but also a lot of aspirin, right? So, why I write in German about these topics? I love German. I've written columns for Taz, and I'm writing a column in the Tagesspiegel now in a couple of days about affirmative action and diversity and so forth in German. I want to reach Germans. I see the bullshit which is written in German even by Afro-Germans. I was on a show with one of the very famous young Afro-German woman. Well, she's about 40, but that's young for me. she asked me shortly before her podcast, oh, and Michaela, when did you have your black coming out? And I'd be like, yeah, in the maternity ward when I was born, right? And I'm not making fun of that because I know being black in Germany, particularly at the time that she was born shortly before the fall of the wall, you know, yeah, it wasn't all that easy either. You didn't have that much community. Being black in America means being part of a very homogenous community. We all speak the same language. Most of us worship Christian. I was Catholic with a lot of black Protestants on my father's side of the family. Where do you think Gospels come from, for example? So the communication there, even decades before social media and all that stuff, was great. In Germany, it's a little bit different. But I want to reach people here who primarily read German, and I want to tell them what it's like from someone who lived through that stuff, And like I said, I see deficits in other books which get more attention. I'm happy my book was 3 weeks in the top 10 of the magazine bestseller list, and I get a lot of speaking engagements. I sold out the Frankfurter Kunstverein recently, and so I'm happy with that. But it bothers me that other books written in German seem to get more attention because their criticism is more mild than my criticism. They're trying to show people in Germany how you can live with racism. And I'm trying to show people in Germany that I want to choke racism in a bathtub and then throw in the radio on top of it. That sounds very violent. But in my book, I don't use trigger warnings in my book, for example. Some people criticize it. I use the language which was thrown at me. I talk about some very violent things in the book, that too, because I'm not making fun of trigger warnings. For example, in trauma psychology, there could be abuse. I was abused. I was sexually abused when I was 15 years old. I know I needed some time to deal with that, and so trigger warnings can be of value in that sense. We didn't call it that then. We just called it, consideration and counseling and so forth. But I don't use, and that is an answer to your question, why in German, it's just an extension of the answer. I just want to explain, I don't use trigger warnings in my book because I don't get any trigger warnings in my life. It's not like when I wake up early in the morning, shortly before noon, I go in the shower, the telephone rings, I come out of the shower, dripping wet with a bathtub. Hello? On the other end of the telephone, yeah, hello, hi, here's the Hans. There's been Hans here, no offense, I just had to put some. Here's the Hans. Michaela, you don't know who I am. I'm a neo-Nazi. We're going to see each other, in the streetcar in about 45 minutes. I'm going to beat you up and spit on you. I just wanted to call you in advance so that you can, your soul could be warned of that in advance, and then you could maybe psychologically better deal with it. We don't get calls like that. We're just thrown into it. And my way of writing about it in German is aimed at showing, primarily German-speaking readers, what it is really like to go through this stuff. And at some point I will translate my own book, but it's something, it was an issue, it was a great interest for me to be able to do that, without being filtered and so forth.
Okay, I'm going to give you the last word, Michaela, but I need to wrap things up, and we have a question here.
Okay.
Hi.
Hi.
I'm just going to stand up so you can see my back. Yes. My question is your book that you wrote about, is it about the racism and the experience you made in America or here in Germany?
Yes.
For me, me personally, I was born and raised here, and I am not American, and I oftentimes feel like our experience...
I still love you anyway.
Yeah, I feel like experiences differ just based on our ethnicity oftentimes, and I wanted to ask, like, the examples that you gave, you have examples of Afro-Germans that talk about racism, and you feel like it's oftentimes watered down or not bullshit, and I wanted to ask for like an example so that I can understand, because...
Okay, I promise I wouldn't mention Chipoka today, for example. So, what did I just do? But you know, I'll say this. They should write the books they want to write. I just basically want to say that everyone should be able to relate his, her, or their experiences there. I do believe that we need more storytelling and more people writing about their own lives. And if they're younger than I am, no problem. They've experienced stuff too. They should write about that instead of trying to duplicate, you know, these platitudes from the Charter of Diversity or something. A book should tell a story, and a book should call out things, and not, you know, just simply walking quietly around the topic, around the elephant in the room, but just saying that's the elephant there, and how do we get it out? And I believe that, and I'm part of the media here too. I write for Review and mainstream newspapers, but my criticism on the media here is they often seek the one black person, the one black woman, or the one, you know, woman of Turkish heritage or whatever, to speak for an entire community. They only focus on that person, and they prefer someone who they regard as being mild enough not to scare away other people. You know, I scare away people because I describe these things. Why should I write a book and not say anything, right? But you know, so I've done some parodies of people like Tupoka or Alice Hasters. I'm not saying that I'm not saying don't buy their books. I repeat, I'm not saying don't buy their books.
Okay, I'm going to, we heard it, it's on tape. Okay, I want to wrap things up. We need about 2 more minutes. You can wait because people are leaving, they're cold and need to get to buses. And I'm going to ask for a Schlusslicht, as we say in German, and from both of you. And before I do that, I would like to thank Laura and Kai for doing all the technical. I would like to thank my team, Hatija, who found Dr. Dudley for me. So much about trans realities and trans rights, and I'd like to thank Catherine and Nika for making this possible. Okay. Schlusslicht, ich schließe mich ein. Sarah from my class, Sarah, you came in, from the law class, said, you know, 2 meetings ago, okay, we've got gerrymandering, we've got the Electoral College, we've got the Supreme Court. How can we go on? What can we do? And Sarah, I found it very powerful what Dr. Dudley said today. We cannot not go on. And so that would be my final word. Laura.
Well, yeah, thank you. Schlusslicht, okay. I think Dr. Dudley, you already mentioned some very important aspects. Not giving up hope, and also engaging community organizing. Just talk to others, share experiences, and then try to go on despite all of that or against all of that. Yeah.
Dr. Dudley.
You better cut me off, please.
It depends on how long you speak, baby.
Ich hab dich auch lieb. So, but basically, I'll just reduce it to 3 sentences. Okay, 3 life sentences, right? No, If you look at who won the popular vote since like the beginning of the 1990s, it was almost always the Democrats, right? And even when the Republicans assumed office, so it was usually on the basis of electoral college antics, or even the legitimate aspects of electoral college deciding that. And that's one of the, so it's kind of built in already, that which the people want somehow has to be filtered out and balanced. Otherwise, why would you need an electoral college in the first place? Why would you need a Senate? You know, if you're breaking away from the British monarchy, why are you going to set up an upper house? Well, you know, what's the point of it? For rich white slave owners to still have a say somehow. So we have to look strategically also at the real validity or the virtues, non-virtues of institutions like electoral college. I think it should be banned like Trump University. You know, he graduated incidentally in the top 100% of his class. Trump, you could say whatever you want to say, but we have to look at the validity of these institutions and say, are they really advancing democracy? But at the same time, we have to keep fighting. A lot of people say, a lot of black people say, why do we always have to vote for the Democrats? They don't do anything for us. They come out every 2 or 4 years and say, vote for us, it's now or never. Yeah, it's really about choosing the lesser of the evils. And at some point we can make a difference, but if we give up, we can't.
Powerful last words. I'd like to thank Laura Borchert and Dr. Dudley, both for their activist work and their strong speaking. Thank you all for being here.
And Max did have a second question. What was your second question? I just wanted to...